The morning the truth surfaced, the mountains refused to speak. Mist clung to the trees like a warning, and the village below lay frozen in a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. Somewhere behind those woods, a secret had already rewritten the laws of nature and morality, a secret so disturbing that even decades later, people struggled to say her name without lowering their voice. She was only 5 years old when her body betrayed childhood. 5 years old when doctors stared at one another in disbelief, when whispers replaced medical certainty, and when the world's understanding of innocence quietly fractured. There were no warning signs, no cries heard in the night, no clear footprints leading to the truth. Just a small child with a swollen abdomen, standing at the edge of something no child should ever face. Authorities came with questions, but the answers dissolved into shadows. The family spoke little. The village spoke less. Every adult denied knowledge, every path led nowhere, and every explanation felt carefully incomplete. Science could confirm what had happened, but not how, and not who. That unanswered who became the most terrifying part. As news spread, disbelief turned into horror. Reporters framed it as an anomaly, doctors labeled it impossible, and the public searched desperately for logic where none seemed to exist. Yet beneath the headlines and clinical terms was a child who had been forced into a role that defied nature itself. A mother before she ever learned what motherhood meant. A victim hidden behind medical records and locked doors. The woods kept their silence. The adults kept theirs too. And the child, too young to understand the enormity of what had been taken from her, became the center of one of the most unsettling mysteries ever recorded. This was not just a medical miracle. It was a human failure. And the truth, buried deep in that quiet place, has never fully come to light. The first turning point begins not with revelation, but with confusion. In the early months of 1939, a child barely old enough to form complete sentences began showing symptoms no one around her could understand. Her abdomen started to swell, slowly at first, then unmistakably. Pain followed, sharp, frequent, frightening pain that left her crying without knowing why. Those around her assumed the simplest explanations: illness, infection, parasites, something common to poverty and rural isolation. No one, not even in their worst imagination, considered the impossible. She was 5 years old. Childhood, by every definition known to science and society, should have protected her from what was unfolding. When her condition worsened, she was taken to doctors who initially echoed the same assumptions. They examined her with detachment, expecting to find disease or malnutrition. But each test erased another possibility, until only one remained, an answer so unthinkable that it felt obscene to say aloud. Medical professionals began repeating examinations, not because the evidence was unclear, but because it was too clear. X-rays revealed a fully formed fetus. Her body, still that of a child, was carrying life. The room reportedly fell silent, not with awe, but with dread. This moment shattered more than medical expectations, it fractured moral certainty. If a child could become pregnant, then something unspeakable had occurred long before any doctor was called. Yet science could only describe what was happening, not how it happened or who was responsible. The discovery marked the moment when the case stopped being a medical anomaly and became a human mystery. Every adult connected to the child was suddenly under an invisible spotlight, though no accusations were spoken aloud. What made this turning point even more disturbing was the absence of visible trauma. There were no clear injuries, no immediate confessions, no witnesses stepping forward. The body told one truth, while the world around it insisted on silence. Doctors documented everything meticulously, aware that history was being written in real time, but also aware that documentation could never capture the emotional weight of what they were seeing. A child's body behaving like an adult's was not a miracle, it was evidence. From this point onward, nothing could return to normal. The child was no longer just a patient, she was a question mark that challenged biology, law, and morality all at once. The swelling abdomen became a symbol of something hidden, something buried so deeply that even when exposed, it refused to explain itself, leaving behind shock, fear, and a truth that no one was prepared to face. The second turning point unfolded as the child was officially admitted to a hospital in the nearby town, a place where curiosity and skepticism collided with the stark reality of the impossible. The moment she arrived, doctors and nurses alike were confronted with the chilling contradiction of innocence and maturity occupying the same fragile body. Every step into the hospital, every examination, seemed surreal, as if the building itself was unprepared to hold such a paradox. The child's parents accompanied her silently, their faces carefully neutral, yet shadows of fear and shame lurked in their eyes. Questions hung in the air, unspoken, because no one knew how to articulate the horror of the situation. Medical charts could capture measurements, vitals, and dates, but they could not record the heavy silence or the sense of disbelief that pervaded the room. Once admitted, the series of tests began. X-rays, physical examinations, and laboratory work confirmed the most unfathomable truth: she was not sick, she was pregnant. Each doctor who reviewed the results reportedly reacted with astonishment, some struggling to believe the evidence before them, others too disturbed to even speak. This hospital, usually a place of healing and explanation, became a theater of impossibility. The child's body, still that of a preschooler, was now carrying life inside it, a development that defied every known law of biology and human development. What should have been the reassuring routine of pediatric care turned into an exercise in grappling with the unthinkable. The hospital staff soon realized the broader implications of their discovery. This was no ordinary case. It demanded secrecy, sensitivity, and extraordinary caution. Officials were contacted, and ethical debates began quietly among medical professionals about how to proceed. There was no playbook for a 5-year-old mother. Every action carried weight, not just medically but morally, socially, and legally. The staff became acutely aware that they were dealing with a human story that intersected with social taboos, cultural fears, and the limits of scientific understanding. At the same time, the child's parents remained largely silent, offering minimal explanation, leaving doctors and nurses to fill the gaps with speculation, unease, and fear. This turning point did more than confirm a shocking fact: it exposed the fragility of understanding and control. Within the sterile walls of the hospital, the boundaries between childhood and adulthood blurred. Every doctor who entered her room, every nurse who attended to her, was forced to confront a reality that seemed almost mythical. The child's body had already rewritten the rules of life and innocence, and those who bore witness could no longer see the world the same way. Each passing hour in that hospital intensified the tension, the fear, and the urgent need for answers that might never come. The third turning point emerged with the realization that the child's condition required immediate intervention, not just observation. By the time doctors confirmed the pregnancy, it was far advanced, and the risk to her life was catastrophic. No hospital in the region had experience managing a case like this, and every medical professional involved understood that a single misstep could be fatal. The situation demanded a precision and courage that felt disproportionate to the patient's age, as if the child's existence had forced the hands of the medical world into uncharted territory. Doctors convened quietly, speaking in hushed tones about surgical procedures normally reserved for adults, weighing the ethical ramifications of operating on someone who could not possibly comprehend what was happening to her own body. They knew that the act of intervention, though necessary, would mark the child permanently, not only physically but emotionally, shaping the rest of her life in ways that could never be undone. As preparations for surgery began, the community around her started to sense the gravity of the situation. Rumors traveled faster than the truth, whispered in markets and on dirt roads, reaching ears that were both curious and fearful. The villagers were confronted with a scenario they had never imagined, a reality that challenged every moral framework they had grown up with. Some viewed it with pity, others with suspicion, and a few with barely suppressed horror. The child, unaware of the full extent of the danger she was in, still carried on with the small gestures of childhood, playing and eating, oblivious to the life-or-death decisions being made around her. This contrast between innocence and crisis made the impending procedure all the more poignant, as if the world itself had paused to observe a collision between human fragility and the cruel absurdity of fate. When the day of the operation arrived, it was executed under conditions that were both tense and extraordinary. Surgeons worked with meticulous care, fully aware that the smallest error could lead to death. Instruments were chosen, incisions measured, and every movement calculated to balance the impossibility of the task with the hope of saving a life. Family members, some in denial, some trembling with fear, lingered outside, leaving the sterile room to the professionals but never fully escaping the anxiety that pulsed in the air. In that moment, time seemed suspended, and the child became a silent fulcrum around which life, death, and morality teetered precariously. The outcome of the operation would not just determine survival, it would redefine the understanding of childhood, innocence, and the terrifying limits of what a human body could endure, setting the stage for the enduring mystery that would follow. The fourth turning point arrived with the delivery, an event that was both miraculous and horrifying, a moment where the impossible became undeniable. The child, barely able to grasp the meaning of what was happening, emerged from the ordeal physically altered, fragile, and yet alive, while the baby she carried, born into circumstances no one could have imagined, cried for the first time in a world unprepared to understand it. Medical staff were astonished, not just by the survival of both mother and child, but by the sheer biological reality that a 5-year-old had carried and delivered life. Every measurement, every observation was meticulously recorded, but the data could not capture the full emotional and ethical weight of what had occurred. Outside the sterile walls, the village's whispers grew louder, transforming from curiosity into fear, from intrigue into something darker, a collective unease that the adults could not name. The child's body, already a site of profound anomaly, now became the center of attention for the press, the scientific community, and the authorities, each driven by motives that ranged from genuine concern to morbid fascination. Reports circulated quickly, mixing fact and speculation, each version more sensational than the last. Some framed it as a miracle of medicine, others as a moral scandal, and a few recognized it as a tragedy that exposed the vulnerabilities of a society unprepared to protect its youngest members. In the midst of this, the child remained disoriented and largely silent, her understanding limited to the discomfort and confusion of sudden attention. She had become both subject and object, a living enigma that demanded observation while offering no answers. Family dynamics shifted as well. Relatives, previously quiet, now faced intense scrutiny and internal pressure. Questions arose, unspoken but heavy, about culpability, protection, and the boundaries of what should have been allowed to happen. The family, navigating shame, fear, and confusion, struggled to balance societal expectations with a need to shield the child from further trauma. Yet secrecy was nearly impossible. The news had leaked beyond the confines of the home, reaching ears that hungered for explanation. The delivery had not only produced a child but had ignited a cascade of social, ethical, and legal complications that no one had anticipated. In the aftermath, the child's life would never be the same. Her body, her role in the village, and her perception of self had all been fundamentally altered in an instant. The birth became a pivotal moment that exposed the limits of understanding, the fragility of innocence, and the moral failures of those tasked with safeguarding her. It was a point of no return, a turning in the narrative where the extraordinary reality could no longer be ignored, and the world around her had to confront a truth it was neither ready nor willing to face. The fifth turning point unfolded as the world outside the hospital began to close in, pressing the child and her family into a harsh spotlight they could neither escape nor control. The birth had confirmed what medicine had whispered in disbelief, and now the implications rippled through every sphere, scientific, social, and moral. Researchers and doctors arrived with notebooks and cameras, eager to document what they described clinically as a unique case, while journalists and locals filled the streets with questions they could barely articulate. The family, unprepared for such scrutiny, oscillated between defensiveness and despair. Privacy, once a given, had vanished, leaving the child exposed to forces far larger than her own comprehension, as if the world had decided she was both evidence and spectacle. Each visitor brought a different lens. Some sought knowledge, others sought sensationalism, and a few, driven by darker curiosity, seemed to measure her like an object rather than a human being. Within this pressure, the child's daily life became unrecognizable. Simple routines of play and school were replaced by examinations, interviews, and constant observation. Medical professionals checked her physical recovery meticulously, while social authorities scrutinized the family's behavior, looking for hints of neglect or complicity. The child, still too young to understand the nature of what had happened, perceived the tension as an unrelenting, confusing presence. She was caught in the strange contradiction of being both extraordinarily fragile and terrifyingly adult, her body carrying evidence of events far beyond the capacity of her mind to process. Every glance she received seemed weighted, and every whispered conversation carried the unspoken fear that she was at the center of something profoundly unnatural. Meanwhile, the outside world wrestled with disbelief. Newspapers and radio broadcasts carried fragments of the story, often exaggerated or distorted, each iteration feeding public fascination and moral panic. Experts debated whether it was a medical anomaly, a social tragedy, or a moral horror, yet none could fully explain the how or why. Communities debated ethics, law, and the boundaries of human experience, but the conversation always circled back to the child, whose innocence had been irrevocably stolen, leaving her existence as both question and answer. The family, pressured from all sides, began to retreat inward, aware that the more they revealed, the more the child's life would be dissected by a world incapable of comprehension. This period marked a turning point because it crystallized the collision between private tragedy and public spectacle. The child was no longer just recovering from a medical crisis, she had become a symbol, a subject of investigation, and a figure of fear and fascination. The events forced those around her to navigate an impossible landscape of protection, accountability, and morality, with every decision carrying consequences that would echo for decades. What had begun as a shocking medical discovery now demanded society's reflection, exposing vulnerabilities, failures, and the limits of human empathy, all centered on a child whose life had been transformed before it had truly begun. The sixth turning point emerged as the realization dawned that the child's story could no longer remain confined to a single household or even a single village. It had begun to demand official recognition, and with recognition came scrutiny from authorities whose questions were both clinical and judicial. Once the birth had been confirmed, it was clear that the anomaly was not merely medical but implicated forces beyond natural explanation, or at least, forces that ordinary society could not tolerate ignoring. Doctors and social workers became increasingly insistent on documenting every detail, from the child's exact age and physical measurements to the circumstances of her upbringing, creating an unrelenting trail of records. The family, already overwhelmed, now faced the dual pressure of protecting the child and complying with officials who demanded clarity, explanations, and in some cases, admissions. The boundary between care and interrogation blurred, leaving the child trapped at the intersection of innocence and obligation, a body whose truth was more important than her understanding. This turning point also marked the entrance of wider societal judgment. Rumors, once limited to whispers among neighbors, began to coalesce into public opinion, shaped by fear, incredulity, and moral panic. Questions about culpability emerged, unspoken but heavy in the air. Who had allowed this to happen, and who was responsible? While the child herself remained incapable of articulating her experience, the adults around her were forced into roles they neither sought nor understood. Their silence, protective or complicit, became a focal point for speculation. The more authorities and outsiders sought clarity, the more the veil of secrecy around the family tightened, creating a tension between exposure and concealment that would define the trajectory of the story for years to come. Simultaneously, the medical community wrestled with the implications. Pediatricians, obstetricians, and scientists debated whether the case represented a rare biological anomaly, a failure of societal protection, or something darker entirely. Each discussion, published or private, emphasized that the child's survival had depended on rapid, unprecedented intervention, yet no theory could fully account for the events leading to that moment. The phenomenon challenged existing knowledge, forcing experts to reconcile the empirical with the impossible. It was no longer a question of observation but of understanding the intersection of biology, ethics, and human vulnerability, a task that proved far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. At the heart of this turning point was a deepening awareness that the child's life had irrevocably shifted from private experience to public concern. Her body and story became instruments through which society measured both its compassion and its limitations, exposing gaps in law, morality, and community responsibility. Every record, every examination, every whispered judgment added layers of complexity, making it clear that the child's existence was now inseparable from the scrutiny it inspired, and that from this moment onward, the forces around her, medical, social, and legal, would shape her life in ways that were as permanent as they were inescapable. The seventh turning point arose as the realization sank in that the child's extraordinary circumstances would define the rest of her early life, forcing her into a reality where innocence and responsibility collided in ways no child should endure. After surviving the birth, she was no longer merely a patient or a subject of medical curiosity. She became the focal point of a story that blurred the boundaries between family, society, and science. Her days, once filled with play and small pleasures, were now regimented with examinations, observations, and constant attention. Every movement, every word, every reaction was scrutinized by adults who were simultaneously fascinated, horrified, and unsure how to respond. The child, unaware of the magnitude of what had happened to her, felt the weight of the world pressing upon her tiny frame, a burden both physical and psychological that no 5-year-old should bear. The sheer unnaturalness of her experience created a tension that permeated every interaction she had, making even the simplest act of living an extraordinary and unsettling event. The family struggled to navigate this new reality. Protective instincts clashed with social pressures, as relatives sought to shield the child from the unrelenting scrutiny while simultaneously responding to officials, journalists, and neighbors who demanded explanation. Every interaction became a negotiation between secrecy and exposure. Parents and caregivers were caught in an impossible balancing act, trying to preserve fragments of normalcy while understanding that the child had already been irrevocably changed. Their fear of judgment, both moral and legal, heightened the sense of isolation, creating a household atmosphere charged with tension and unspoken anxiety. The child, sensitive to the emotions around her even if she could not comprehend the full implications, absorbed the atmosphere, further complicating the already fraught dynamics of her daily existence. Meanwhile, public fascination escalated into obsession. News reports, medical journals, and local gossip painted her story in dramatic, often distorted tones. Some viewed her survival as miraculous, others as evidence of moral decay, while many struggled to reconcile the reality with their understanding of childhood. The child, who had been thrust into the center of these conflicting narratives, existed simultaneously as an object of pity, a symbol of scientific anomaly, and a source of communal fear. The stories told about her life began to shape perception more than the life itself ever could, and the lines between her own experience and the external narrative started to blur, leaving her vulnerable to the weight of interpretation. This turning point underscored the profound consequences of the event. The child was no longer simply living, she was being observed, analyzed, and defined by forces beyond her comprehension. Every decision by adults, every look from a stranger, and every written account contributed to an environment that transformed her early years from a time of learning and innocence into a complex interplay of survival, observation, and societal expectation. Her existence had become both a personal reality and a public spectacle, a collision of childhood and circumstance that would leave its mark long after the immediate crisis had passed. The eighth turning point occurred as the story's implications began to ripple far beyond the immediate circle of the family and the village, forcing the broader world to confront a reality that defied understanding. By this stage, medical records, photographs, and detailed accounts had circulated among professionals, journalists, and the curious public, transforming the case from a private tragedy into an enduring global phenomenon. Scholars and doctors debated endlessly, attempting to classify the situation within the confines of science, while ethicists and legal experts wrestled with questions of accountability, consent, and protection. Yet no matter how meticulously the facts were recorded, the core of the story, the human experience of the child herself, remained largely inaccessible, a silent witness to a world grappling with shock and disbelief. The case, impossible to ignore, demanded reflection not only on biology but on society's failures to safeguard its most vulnerable members. The child's daily existence became further entwined with these external forces. She was no longer simply recovering from a traumatic event, she was living under a microscope, her body and her actions subject to observation that blurred the line between medical necessity and invasive scrutiny. Every checkup, every inquiry, and every visit from an outsider reinforced the understanding that her life had been permanently altered, that she could never again experience childhood as others did. Even her family, despite their protective instincts, could not shield her entirely from the implications of exposure. The weight of attention, both clinical and public, imposed an unspoken responsibility upon her, a consciousness of being different, extraordinary, and vulnerable all at once. Meanwhile, society's fascination carried both admiration and fear, a duality that complicated the narrative surrounding the child. Some saw in her survival a testament to human resilience and the marvels of medical intervention, while others framed the story as a cautionary tale of innocence violated and societal neglect. Rumors and exaggerations amplified the horror, spreading through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth, and often obscuring the reality with layers of sensationalism. These competing interpretations created a climate of uncertainty, where truth was entangled with speculation, and the child's actual experience became secondary to the narratives imposed upon her. This turning point underscored the profound ethical and social dilemmas inherent in her story. The child's existence, once a private matter, had become a lens through which society measured both its knowledge and its moral compass. Adults around her were forced to navigate a labyrinth of responsibility, empathy, and public expectation, aware that every action or inaction could leave lasting consequences. Her life had become a living paradox, a miracle to some, a tragedy to others, and above all, a silent, uncomprehending witness to forces far beyond her understanding, setting the stage for a legacy of scrutiny, fascination, and enduring mystery. The ninth turning point emerged as the focus shifted from immediate survival and medical documentation to the long-term implications of the child's unprecedented experience, highlighting the enduring psychological and social consequences that would define her existence. By now, the initial shock had settled into a complex mixture of fascination, pity, and unease, with society grappling to reconcile the reality of a 5-year-old mother with deeply ingrained notions of childhood and innocence. For the child, life had become an unending cycle of observation and expectation, where her body was scrutinized as if it were both evidence and enigma, and her every action carried a weight that no child should bear. While doctors celebrated her survival and the baby's health, the emotional and psychological toll on her remained largely unacknowledged, hidden behind medical charts and public discourse, as if her humanity could be compartmentalized, quantified, and analyzed. As attention persisted, the child's family continued to navigate a precarious balance between protection and exposure. They faced constant pressure from authorities, journalists, and neighbors, all of whom sought some insight into the circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. Questions hovered in the air. How could this have happened? Who was responsible, and why had it been allowed to occur? Each unanswered question intensified the scrutiny on the child, and while some relatives attempted to shield her from the worst of it, others were drawn into conversations and inquiries that eroded privacy and amplified fear. The household became a site of tension, a place where trust, secrecy, and survival intersected, and where every interaction carried the potential to alter the child's sense of safety or identity. In many ways, the environment itself became another form of exposure, compounding the trauma that had already been imposed upon her body and mind. Meanwhile, the broader world's fascination with the story reached new levels of intensity. Medical professionals documented her growth and development with meticulous attention, eager to understand the physical implications of such an extraordinary case, while journalists and storytellers framed her life as a narrative that blurred the line between miracle and horror. Public opinion oscillated between wonder and moral judgment, with debates over innocence, culpability, and human limitation dominating discourse. The child herself, too young to contextualize or defend her experience, existed at the center of a storm she could neither control nor fully comprehend. Her reality was shaped not only by her own experiences but by the interpretations, assumptions, and projections of everyone around her, creating a layered and inescapable tension between being observed and simply being. This turning point highlighted that the story was no longer about the event itself but about its ramifications, the way society interprets, reacts to, and judges the unimaginable. The child's existence had become a mirror reflecting the discomfort, fascination, and ethical dilemmas of those around her, and the world's need to categorize and understand her reality collided with the unalterable truth of her lived experience. The intensity of observation, speculation, and expectation created a permanent, invisible weight on her early life, transforming survival into an ongoing, inescapable ordeal that would shape the trajectory of her story for decades to come. The 10th turning point crystallized as the long-term consequences of the child's extraordinary circumstances became undeniable, forcing everyone involved to confront the intersection of innocence, exploitation, and survival. By this stage, the initial shock and fascination had evolved into a sustained scrutiny that would follow her for the rest of her life, creating an environment where privacy, normalcy, and childhood itself were effectively erased. The world had witnessed an event that defied comprehension, a 5-year-old mother, and now the lingering question was not only how it happened, but what it would mean for her future. The child, though still incapable of understanding the full scope of her experience, lived under an invisible weight of expectation and observation, as if every moment of her growth and behavior were being catalogued and judged. Her body, once a vessel of unimaginable anomaly, remained a symbol, a point of obsession for medical professionals, journalists, and the public alike, ensuring that her life would never be ordinary or free from the legacy of that single, defining event. The family's role remained fraught with tension and complexity. They continued to oscillate between attempts to protect her and the pressures imposed by authorities and outsiders. Every decision, from daily care to interactions with neighbors or reporters, carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. While they sought to shield her from further trauma, the very act of shielding required engagement with those who sought access to her story, reinforcing a cycle of exposure and concealment. The family's private struggles became entwined with public curiosity, transforming what should have been a domestic recovery into an ongoing negotiation with a world unwilling to look away. This dynamic created a persistent psychological tension that was both invisible and profound, shaping the child's experience of safety, trust, and identity. Simultaneously, society at large wrestled with the implications of her story. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about childhood, innocence, and human development, prompting debates that ranged from the medical to the moral. Experts dissected her body and history in the pursuit of understanding, while the public oscillated between horror, fascination, and pity. The child, however, remained largely voiceless, her own perspective overshadowed by the narratives imposed upon her by adults who sought explanation, sensationalism, or reassurance. In this way, she became a living symbol, a mirror reflecting society's discomfort with the limits of understanding and its compulsion to categorize the unexplainable. This turning point underscored that the child's existence was now inseparable from the extraordinary circumstances of her past. Her life, once intended to unfold in the quiet rhythms of childhood, had been irrevocably reshaped by forces beyond her control. Every day became a negotiation between survival and scrutiny, between the private reality of her experience and the public demands for understanding, leaving a permanent mark on her identity and the collective consciousness of those who bore witness. The legacy of what had begun as a singular, unthinkable event continued to echo, shaping perceptions, decisions, and ethical considerations in ways that would endure far beyond the moment itself.